Good evening. I'm talking today about the parable of Jesus that relates to these two men who went up to the temple to pray. And we find that parable in Luke the 18th chapter in verses 9 through 14. Now, probably no other parable that Jesus ever told makes me personally more uncomfortable, more convicted, more introspective, or gives me more consternation than this parable that I am talking about today. We're told in the first verse of our text to whom this parable was directed. And in Luke 18:9 says this: He told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated other people with contempt. Most of us have probably heard of Jeff Foxworthy. As you'll recall, Jeff Foxworthy is an expert when it comes to the identification of rednecks. And he knows a redneck when he sees one, and probably his most famous expression is, "You might be a redneck if." And in that light, I might say that we might be in this parable if any of the things that I will say today are true of us and how we feel about God and how we feel about our fellow man. Do we ever look at people who do not go to church and we think that we're better than they are because we do go to church? If we do, Jesus is talking to us in this parable. Do we ever look at prison and look at people who are in prison and we think that spiritually they are there and that we are better spiritually than they are? If we think like that, we may be in this parable. Do we ever look at someone who is living in sexual sin or who has made terrible financial choices and thank God because we have never done that? If we have, Jesus is talking with us in this parable. Folks, we need to remind ourselves that in the eyes of God, sin is sin. And all of us sin every day. So what I want us to do today is to look at ourselves and see if we can determine if we are really right with God. And in doing that, I would like for us to keep this key takeaway in mind. And that's this: when we look up to God, we will never look down on other people. So in this parable that we're talking about today, we will see one man who was rejected by God and one man who was accepted by God. And it all had to do with where they looked and how they looked at God and themselves and other people. Before we go any further, I would remind everyone of what I and others have told you quite often, and that is this: we must like ourselves, not in a better than thou attitude, but in a healthy attitude. We must like ourselves before we can like anybody else. Now, there are two ways that we can look at ourselves. First of all, we can look at ourselves comparatively. Now, whenever we continue in our text, Luke 18 verses 10 and 11 says this: Two men went into the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. So folks, what the Pharisee was really saying about the tax collector was this: let's get something straight. I'm not like you, and you are certainly not like me. You are not close to God like I am, and I don't belong in your company, and you certainly do not belong in mine, and I don't want to have anything to do with you. And then he probably reached into his bag, he pulled out a mirror, looked at himself in the mirror, and began to sing, "How Great Thou Art." Now, notice again what the Pharisee said in verse 11, where he said, "God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, and even like this tax collector." And then he goes on in the next verse and he says, "I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get." So the Pharisee, he did the same thing that we do whenever we compare ourselves to other people. We tend to compare ourselves to people who we think are below us, and we never compare ourselves to people who we think are above us, unless, of course, we're trying to feel sorry for ourselves. So let me make this very candid statement. Let me ask you this question. Is there anyone that you know for whom you have nothing but contempt? Is there anyone that you look down upon, maybe because of their body type, their race, their color, their education, their job, their socioeconomic status in life, or anything else? And so the Pharisee, he was bragging not only about the things that he had done, that is, he was not an extortioner, he was not an unjust man, he was not an adulterer, he wasn't even like this tax collector, but then he bragged about the things that he had done or was doing. And that is, he fasted twice a week, and he tithed of everything that he had. Now, you'll recall that back in Bible days, there were 3 special holidays on which every Jew was required to fast. But they only were required to fast on that special day. Now, if you were what we might call a normal Pharisee, you would fast 2 days before the holiday, the day of the holiday, and 2 days after the holiday, or a total of 5 days. And you would do that 3 times a year for a total of 15 days. So the average Jew would fast 3 days a year, and a normal Pharisee would fast 15 days a year. This Pharisee, however, said that he fasted twice a week, or a total of 104 times a year. That is 33 and a half times more than the average Jew, and 7 times more than a normal Pharisee. So, in addition to fasting, this Pharisee said that he tithed, that is, he gave 10% of all that he gets. Now, why is that such a big deal? Well, keep in mind that in the Old Testament, they were only commanded to tithe on 3 things: their grain, their oil, and their wine. But this Pharisee said, I tithe on everything. Now, if he had a yard sale, which they didn't have back then, he tithed on the receipts of the yard sale. If he won the lottery, which of course they didn't have back then, he tithed on the receipts of the lottery. If he received a bonus, he tithed on the bonus. If he received tax-deferred income, and of course they didn't know what that was at the time, but if he did, he tithed on that income without regard as to taxes. So he tithed on everything that he earned and everything he was possessed. So he was loud and proud, and he thought he was right with God because of two things. Those things that he had not done, and those things that he had done or was still in the process of doing. So instead of looking in this mirror and seeing how great they are, what he should have done was been looking in the mirror and singing "You're So Vain," which, as you'll recall, was an early 1970s song by Carly Simon. So this Pharisee thought he could look at two directions at the same time. He thought he could look up at God and down at people at the same time. Well, we can do one or the other. We can either look up to God or we can look down on people, but we cannot do the same thing at the same time. You see, this Pharisee, he just didn't get it. He reminds me of a little fifth grade girl who came home from school one day all excited. And she told her mother that she had just had the most exciting thing in the world happen to her at school. And so her mother asked her what it was, and this little girl says, "I was voted the prettiest girl in class today." To which her mother said, "Honey, that's wonderful." Now, the next day, the little girl came home from school even more excited than the previous day. She told her mother, "I was voted most likely to succeed today." And on the third day, the little girl came home even more pumped than ever. And she told her mother that she had been voted the smartest girl in class. Now, the fourth day, this little girl came home and her mother could hear her crying as she got off the school bus. And so after she had calmed down a little bit, her mother asked her what had happened. And she said, "Did you lose today?" And this little girl said, "No, I didn't lose today. I was voted the most stuck up." Now, whenever we see someone who is stuck up, as we might say, and there was a lady in the congregation, in my congregation, used to say, this Pharisee had what she called an I problem. 5 times in the verses that we see, this Pharisee had said the word I. You see, he suffered from 2 problems. He suffered, first of all, from inflation, and then from deflation. And those 2 terms are entirely different. He had an inflated view as to who he was, and he had a deflated view as to who he thought God and other people were. So, folks, I beg you this day, let's stop comparing ourselves to others. You see, so many people, they have all kinds of problems because they want to compare themselves with other people. And so that destroys friendships and does a lot of terrible damage. So here's what happens when we compare ourselves with people who are worse off than we are. It fills us with pride. And when we compare ourselves with people who are better off than we are, it fills us with bitterness and jealousy. And neither one of these 2 ways is the way for us to properly look at ourselves. So we don't want to look at ourselves comparatively. Rather, we want to see ourselves as we really are. We want to see ourselves correctly. You see, we see this tax collector in Luke 18:13, which says this, "But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, 'God be merciful to me, a sinner.'" So these 2 men are completely different. Not only did the tax collector not give money to the church, he stole money from the people who went to church. And that is why the tax collector stood, as the scripture says, far off. That's what he was expected to do. Nobody would have anything to do with him. And if you've ever been in that situation, you know how he must have felt. Now, when the Pharisee walked in, he got a front row seat. But when the tax collector walked in, he went to the back of the room in the darkest corner that he could find. Now, while the Pharisee was too proud to look up, the tax collector was too ashamed to look up. Now, the Pharisee, he was sticking out his chest. The tax collector was beating his chest, and what he said, in effect, was this: God, I know I have a filthy heart. I know that I am unclean. And folks, I want us to learn a great lesson about these two men and about the mercy of God, and that is this: God will not give mercy to those who think they don't need it, but he will give it to those who recognize that they need it and ask for it. You see, some of us people are so proud that we could strut sitting down. And folks, let me tell you, that is something that's impossible to do. You know, if we don't think we need the mercy of God, let me assure you that we will not get it. But if we know that we need it and we ask God for it, it's available to us. And so this tax collector, he was seeing himself correctly, and the only way that we can see ourselves correctly is that if we first of all see God correctly. The Pharisee walked in, and when he saw the tax collector, he said, I am so glad that I am not like you. The tax collector walked in and said, I'm so glad you're not like me either. I wish that I wasn't like me. And boy, what a difference in these two men. You see, there's only one person who receives mercy, and that is the person who asks for it. There's only one person who asks for it, and that is the person who recognizes that he needs it. And there is only one person who recognizes that he needs mercy, and that is the person who sees the ways of God and understands that God sees us as we really are. You know, folks, our best friends may think that we're the greatest person in the world, but God sees us as we really are. So after we see ourselves correctly, then we can see God clearly. The parable continues in the 14th verse, where Jesus drops a bomb whenever he says this: I tell you, this man, who was the tax collector, went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but everyone who humbles himself will be exhausted. You know, if everyone listening to this parable as Jesus told it, they probably had grown up thinking that the Pharisee was the good guy and the tax collector was the bad guy. The Pharisee wore the white hat and the tax collector wore the black hat. And if you had taken a vote among all the people who were listening to Jesus that day, the vote would probably have been unanimous that the Pharisee would have been the one most likely to get to heaven. Now, the most important word in this story is the word justified. And Holman's Bible Dictionary says that justification is the act of God based upon the work of Christ on the cross, whereby a sinner, that's us, is pronounced righteous by the imputation of the righteousness of Christ. You see, one of these two men who went up to pray went home right before God, but the other man went home wrong before God. One of these two men went home in the kingdom, but the other went home outside the kingdom. One of these men thought that he was guilty, but he went home innocent. And the other man thought that he was innocent, but he went home guilty. You see, and the only way that the tax collector was able to see God correctly was that he saw God clearly, which the Pharisee did not do. Folks, I dare say that a lot of us have done exactly what I have done every time that I have read this parable. We said something like this: I thank God that I am not like this self-righteous Pharisee. And whenever we say that, folks, that means we are, in fact, just like the Pharisee. You know, I'm a minister, and I have lived the type of life that most people would expect a minister to live. But having said that, I recognize that, like everybody else in the world, I am in desperate need of the mercy of God. I am in desperate need of the saving power of Jesus Christ on the cross. Because as we're told in Scripture, all of my righteousness and all of your righteousness is as filthy rags before a holy and righteous God. Thank you very much.